In these next few chapters of Dracula, we meet the rest of our cast of characters. Whereas up until now, things have been exclusively from Jonathan Harker's perspective, now multiple points of view are coming into play. First, we meet two women through the correspondences that they have with each other, Mina Murray and Lucy Westenra. Mina's name is already familiar to us. She's Jonathan Harker's fiance, and she's worried about him while he's away on his trip, and she misses him, so she talks about him frequently. Mina's a hard worker. She's a schoolmistress, and she's been practicing shorthand, which we already knew from last week's readings because, if you'll remember, Harker was writing to her in shorthand to keep what he wanted to say a secret from the Count, and the Count got kind of mad when he looked at the writing and he didn't understand it. And it's interesting that in her letters to Lucy, she explains why she's writing down everything so assiduously. She's modeling herself off of journalists who can memorize lengthy conversations and record them later into their diaries. She wants to be able to keep extensive records of all of her and Harker's dealings. So Stoker doesn't just assume that we, as the readers, will accept the coming diary entries as a given. He provides an in-text explanation for why she's keeping the diary in order to make the story even more believable to us. Lucy is a bit more inexperienced and sheltered than Mina. She's an incredibly feeling, sensitive girl, more apt to be emotionally affected by the things that happen to her and to her environment. She's also very empathetic. She feels for the pain of others, and she thinks of them before herself. Both girls appear to be well educated. They both appear to be somewhat conservative. Mina, at one point, makes fun of the idea of the new woman, which was sort of an early feminist. And both of them are in love, so they're writing back and forth about their love life and their expectations of the future. And Lucy writes about an interesting and awkward experience that she's had. She's proposed to 3 times by 3 different men in the same day. And because she's so empathetic, it really tears her apart to have to reject 2 of them. She feels as if she's done something wrong or she's a bad person. And at one point, she actually wishes that she could just marry all 3 of them so no one's feelings get hurt. Things are made even more awkward by the fact that these 3 men are all friends with each other. The first one who proposes to her is a doctor, John Seward. He runs a lunatic asylum. The more modern, politically correct term would be a psychiatric hospital. And if you remember from last week's readings, this is the same asylum that is right next door to the property that Count Dracula purchased in London, the Carfax estate. So we can anticipate that Seward is going to run across Dracula's path at some point because they're neighbors. He just doesn't know it yet. Another man who proposes to Lucy is an American, a man from Texas named Quincy Morris, who is clearly written to reflect the sort of Wild Wild West cowboy stereotypes about Americans that would have been common in England in the 19th century. His language is full of what we would probably think of as cliches now, but that's just how he talks. But he's a kind-hearted nobleman, and so is Seward, and both of them take Lucy's rejection in a well-mannered way. They both say that they hope they can still be friends, and that if she ever needs them, they'll always be there for her. And the third man who proposes to her, the man who she loves, is a nobleman. His father is Lord Godalming, a title which he is soon to inherit as well. And his name is Arthur Holmwood. And it's a testament to the friendship that he has with Seward and Morris that afterward they all get together so that the 2 who were rejected can congratulate and celebrate with the one who was accepted. Unselfish love, chivalric love, you might say, is something that we'll see being displayed by these human characters time and time again, contrasted with the devouring, life-sucking desires of Dracula and the female vampires. After we learn about Lucy's proposals through this exchange of letters, Mina goes to visit her and her mother in the seaside town of Whitby, which Stoker describes to us in great detail. It's a very old town and a tourist destination, which is probably why Lucy and her mother are there. It's situated on 2 high cliffs on either side of the river Esk, which runs down into the sea. and both cliffs are really steep with houses built up the sides of them, and on the east cliff is a churchyard and an old abbey from the 7th century, and I believe it's still there. Lucy's lodgings are on the west cliff, but she and Mina frequently walk down to the river, cross a bridge, and then walk back up the east cliff to sit in the churchyard, which affords a great view of the sea. It better, because it sounds like that's a lot of exercise, having to walk down a hill and up a hill there and back every day. Whitby is situated in the Yorkshire Moors, very near to where Wuthering Heights was set, which explains why we meet characters who talk like Joseph in the Yorkshire dialect. Mina and Lucy have several conversations with an interesting old sailor who is very opinionated and who doesn't really like being corrected or challenged in his opinions. Also kind of like Joseph. They talk like each other and they kind of behave like each other. One example of this is that he doesn't approve of all the tombstones in the churchyard because he says that they're all lies. That half of the men there were lost at sea and their bodies were never found. So any tombstone that says, "Here lies John Smith," is just telling a lie. He doesn't lie there at all. And the sailor doesn't like this because he thinks that when Judgment Day comes, all of the men lost at sea are going to have to come find their tombstones to carry with them up to heaven, and that there's going to be a lot of confusion because no one will know who is who, whose tombstone's whose, because they're all written with lies. Why would the spirits of the resurrected need to take their tombstones up to heaven with them? Mina and Lucy question him on this, but he doesn't really provide them with an answer. He just acts like it's a given. He says, "Oh, of course they'll take their tombstones with them. Why wouldn't they?" And I mentioned this bit of dialogue, even though it doesn't have much to do with the story itself, because it's a good example of how Stoker is touching on important themes and imagery, even in the less important, funny, kind of passing moments of the novel. Here we have a sailor talking about empty graves and the dead being resurrected, keeping those ideas fresh in our minds for when all of this happens later in regard to Dracula. So Mina and Lucy are enjoying their vacation, and we start to get a better understanding of their relationship between the two. They've been friends ever since they were little girls, but Mina is more of the caretaker. She worries about Lucy's health all the time and about her state of mind. And while they're on this vacation, Lucy starts sleepwalking. This is apparently a common occurrence with her, and it's hereditary, something that her father used to do too. And so Mina starts having to keep one eye open at night to make sure Lucy doesn't wander out of the house or get into any sort of mischief. Again, keeping in mind that they're living on a very steep cliff, so it wouldn't be that hard to walk outside of the house at night and have a misstep in the dark and tumble down to your death. It is this sleepwalking that gets Lucy into trouble. When Dracula arrives in Whitby, which we'll talk about in a minute, he finds her up on the east cliff in the churchyard, sitting at the spot that she likes to sit at in the daytime. And we might ask why Dracula decided to pick Lucy to start feeding from. It might just be that she was wandering around at night, unprotected, sure. But we also have reason to believe, after reading about a patient in Dr. Seward's asylum, that Dracula's presence can be more easily felt by those whose minds are disturbed in some sense. Somnambulism, or sleepwalking, is a sleep disorder in which sleep and wakefulness are combined. In this state, the sleepwalker can be partially open or can be particularly open to the power of suggestion, which means that their waking conscious, their rational faculty isn't fully operating, even though they're moving around and behaving as if though they were awake. Mina mentions that all she has to do is gently lead Lucy back to bed, and she obeys, almost as if she's hypnotized. And I think it's likely that Lucy's mind, not so much Lucy herself, is what calls out to Dracula, while it was in this state between sleeping and waking. Dr. Seward's patient, a man named Renfield, also appears to have some sort of telepathic connection with Dracula. He has some disturbed notion, a monomania, a word which we've encountered in this class before, about life-eating or life-consuming. Dr. Seward calls him a zoophagist, someone who feels compelled to consume as much life as possible. and he captures flies and feeds them to spiders, and then in turn feeds those spiders to birds, and then he eats the birds. So not only has he consumed one animal life, he's also cumulatively consumed all of the lives that were previously eaten by that animal. And this is a disturbed idea that Renfield has apparently had for some time, but once Dracula comes to London, they seem to sense each other. And again, it's not so much that Dracula calls out to Renfield, but that Renfield calls out to him. Keeping in mind that Dracula represents the unknown, or the subconscious, it makes sense that he has greater sway over these individuals whose minds, to a greater or lesser extent, are unbalanced in some way. With Lucy, it's a very mild state of unbalance, nowhere near compared to Renfield, but still. And I actually want to go back and read a quote from Crime and Punishment that I think illustrates this idea really well. And it's something that Svidrigailov said. When he first met Raskolnikov, he was talking about a theory that he had developed that ghosts and apparitions only appeared to the sick, not to the healthy. And here is why. Apparitions are, this is Svidrigailov speaking, so to speak, shreds and fragments of other worlds, the first beginnings of them. There is, of course, no reason why a healthy man should see them, because a healthy man is mainly a being of this earth, and therefore, for completeness and order, he must live only this earthly life. But as soon as he falls ill, as soon as the normal earthly state of the organism is disturbed, the possibility of another world begins to appear, and as the illness increases, so do the contacts with the other world, so that at the moment of a man's death, he enters fully into that world. It's a long time since I first developed this argument. If you believe in the life hereafter, you may accept this reasoning too, and then he goes on from there. So if being ill, either physically, mentally, or both, lowers our defenses that keep us tethered to the world of reality, so to speak, it makes sense that Dracula, something like an apparition himself, would have a stronger bond with these two characters than he would with others. Their defenses are lowered. They're kind of in between worlds, between the world of waking and sleeping in Lucy's case, or the world of rationality and madness in Renfield's case. And so Dracula can kind of slip between the cracks there and make a connection with him that he can't with other people. And this also reminds me, strangely, of something that happens in the Harry Potter novels as well. Remember that, I think in the 5th book, that there's an almost subconscious connection between Harry and Voldemort that neither one of them seem to be able to fully control at first. But they can sense each other's presence. They have dreams about what the other one's doing. And that's why Professor Snape tells Harry that he has to discipline his mind. And I think that the same thing is going on here too with Dracula. And Lucy's mind, when she's sleepwalking, is completely defenseless and, like I said, open to the power of suggestion. And so Dracula feeds on her that first night when she's sleepwalking. And then he begins doing this each night afterward, which we might find a bit surprising, because in most vampire stories and movies that we see or read, the drinking of the victim's blood usually occurs in just one act. But here he keeps coming back each night. He never drinks enough to kill her outright, and Mina doesn't know what's wrong. Lucy's health has always been a bit poor, apparently, or at least we can kind of infer that from the concern that Mina has for her. And now, for no apparent reason, it looks like she's wasting away. Eventually, things get so bad that Lucy's fiancé, Arthur, asks Seward to come look at her, and Seward calls in a favor in his turn to a friend from Amsterdam, Dr. Van Helsing. And we'll talk more about him next week, but he's another character whose dialect Bram Stoker attempts to replicate in the text. He doesn't speak very good English, and so his letters to Seward take a bit of time to make sense out of. But if you were reading the portions written by him and you thought that maybe there was a mistake in your copy of the novel and that the editor or the typesetter just screwed things up entirely, don't worry, that wasn't an error. That's just how Van Helsing's writing looks. So Van Helsing isn't sure what's wrong with Lucy either, but right now everyone is operating under the assumption that she's sick. And while we're on that subject, let's talk about the role of sickness in this novel. I mentioned last week about how an important theme of this book is the unknown danger, right? Trying to control the uncontrollable. And obviously, Dracula is the most prominent example of this, but there are others too, and illness or sickness is one of them. Not only is Lucy ill, her mother is terminally ill. In fact, everyone's tiptoeing around Mrs. Westenra, trying not to let her suspect that there's anything wrong with Lucy, because they're afraid that the shock and the stress of the situation might cause her heart to give out. She has some sort of a heart condition that isn't really well defined, but it doesn't really need to be, I guess, for the purposes of the story. Arthur Holmwood's father is also gravely ill, and he's in the kind of unfortunate position of having to go back and forth between his father's sickbed and Lucy's. So it seems like just about everybody is dealing with some sort of sickness or disease. And like Dracula, illness is something that we can't control entirely, no matter how advanced we get in technology and in science. Fear of sickness is very similar to fear of invasion or fear of the unknown in general, because when it comes, there's no sure bulwark or defense against it. And so naturally, it's something that the 19th century, which liked to have an answer for everything, feared greatly. And this is still true, of course, today, as recent events have shown. In fact, it seems like the more advanced a culture becomes, the more insecure it is when it's faced with the unknown or with some sort of danger that it doesn't have an immediate answer for. And actually, we'll end today's lecture with one more example of this. Add to the sickness and to Dracula himself the ungovernable powers of nature itself. Bram Stoker goes into great detail depicting the storm that washes in the ship on which Dracula is stowed away. And I'll read you bits of that description now. And it actually occurs in chapter 7, and it's taken from a supposed newspaper, and this is, of course, Bram Stoker's invention, but the correspondent of the newspaper is telling the story of this great storm that's happened. And he says, "The approach of sunset was so very beautiful, so grand in its masses of splendidly colored clouds that there was quite an assemblage on the walk along the cliff in the old churchyard to enjoy the beauty. Before the sun dipped below the black mass of Kettleness, standing boldly athwart the western sky, its downward way was marked by myriad clouds of every sunset color, flame, purple, pink, green, violet, and all the tints of gold, with here and there masses not large, but of seemingly absolute blackness, in all sorts of shapes, as well outlined as colossal silhouettes. So the storm begins on this really pleasant evening. The sky is just beautiful, and everybody's kind of crowded around outside to look up at it. The wind fell away entirely during the evening, and at midnight there was a dead calm, a sultry heat, and that prevailing intensity which, on the approach of thunder, affects persons of a sensitive nature. And perhaps you've had that experience too. Maybe it's summertime and you're standing outside in the yard, and it's right before a thunderstorm hits, and you can almost feel it. The air feels heavy, and you can smell the rain in the air, and you know that the thunder's coming. And then as soon as you go inside, it all gets unleashed. In fact, affecting persons of a sensitive nature kind of makes me think of Lucy again. Maybe she's affected by the thunderstorm in the same way that she's affected by Dracula. People who don't have this sensitive nature don't really feel it coming, but because she's so sort of attuned to the things around her, she does. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the stillness of the air grew quite oppressive, and the silence was so marked that the bleating of a sheep inland, or the barking of a dog in the town was distinctly heard, and the band on the pier, with its lively French air, was like a discord in the great harmony of nature's silence. A little after midnight came a strange sound from over the sea, and high overhead the air began to carry a strange, faint, hollowing boom. Then, without warning, the tempest broke. With a rapidity which at the time seemed incredible and even afterwards is impossible to realize, the whole aspect of nature at once became convulsed. The waves rose in growing fury, each overtopping its fellow. till in a very few minutes the lately glassy sea was like a roaring and devouring monster. White-crested waves beat madly on the level sands and rushed up the shelving cliffs. Others broke over the piers, and with their spume swept the lanterns of the lighthouses which rise from the end of either pier of Whitby Harbor. The wind roared like thunder, and blew with such force that it was with difficulty that even strong men kept their feet, or clung with grim clasp to the iron stanchions. It was found necessary to clear the entire piers from the mass of onlookers, or else the fatalities of the night would have been increased manifold. To add to the difficulties and dangers of the time, masses of sea fog came drifting inland, white, wet clouds which swept it by in ghostly fashion, so dank and damp and cold that it needed but little effort of imagination to think that the spirits of those lost at sea were touching their living brethren with the clammy hands of death, and many a one shuddered as the wreaths of sea mist swept by. And that fog, of course, is probably more Dracula's doing than the storms, because I think we mentioned last week that Dracula has the power to create fog. And he can actually control the weather, too, so maybe the storm itself is part of Dracula's doing. But in either case, we see this great storm being depicted in all its stages. The anticipation of it, the dread, the heavy calm right before it breaks, and then the full fury of the storm itself. And the storm behaves in a way that makes it a great representative of the unknown menace or threat, which we've been talking about. It comes out of nowhere. Once it hits, there's nothing that anybody can do. They're just at its mercy. Another example, again, of how mankind is never completely in control of everything, even if it thinks it is. So, during the storm, the ship crashes into the harbor and a giant dog leaps off board and runs away. And you'll find as we continue reading that this giant dog is one of the many forms that Dracula can transform himself into, as well as a bat. He's killed the crew members of the ship one by one, and now he's loose in England. Jonathan Harker is also on his way back to England. He's been tended to in a Catholic hospital in Budapest, which is in Romania. And of course, all of the nurses and doctors thought he was out of his mind because he was ranting and raving about this castle. But one of them is able to write to Mina, and she leaves Lucy to go fetch him home. So for next time, read chapters 10 through 14 of Dracula, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.